Hi, everyone. All right, today I'd like to talk about sex, gender, and gender roles. Um, this is going to be kind of a continuation of some of the inequality we were speaking about with regard to race and ethnicity. In fact, a lot of the things that we talked about in those previous videos, you'll find will be relatively easily portable into talking about these topics. So, for example, where we have racial prejudice, racist ideology, individual racial discrimination, and institutional race-based discrimination, you can take those same four concepts and you can essentially swap out sex or gender. So, sexist ideologies or gender prejudice, individual gender discrimination, institutional gender discrimination, right? You can see that those concepts work the same, so you can do that sort of synthesis and portability on your own. I won't really rehash all of that, but what I do want to talk a little bit about in this video is how we construct sex and gender, the way in which we as a society and culture link those two concepts together in a way that sort of shapes our understanding of them. Talk a little bit about stratification, the way that society is stratified by sex and gender, and then talk a little bit about the biological and social underpinnings, or what we call the bases, of gender roles. So we'll get started with looking at sex as a social construct. So, as you know, when sociology talks about social constructs, they're talking about the understandings that we build based off of things that exist in the world outside of us, right? So the biological variation on which we create racial classification is real. It's a function of melanin levels in one's skin cells, or certain kinds of hair color and texture, eye shape, eye color, things of that nature. So those differences are physical. So when we come to doing the same thing over in this category of sex categorization, we do the same thing, right? We build on the biological distinctiveness between males and females to generate an understanding of what we call sex. And sex is the biological fact of maleness and femaleness. It is still a social construct, which is to say that while there are biological differences that exist between males and females, when we talk about sex, when we as a culture and a society deal with sex, we're talking about it in terms of our understandings of those differences, not the actual differences themselves, but the understandings that we've built on top of them. That is the social construct. And it's not just the United States, this is a fairly broad pattern throughout the world, but we in the United States understand sex as two things. One, a binary. Now, a binary is a set of categories in which there are two options, in this case, male and female. Every human organism that exists goes into one of those two categories, and they are exclusive, right? You can be male or you can be female, right? But there's no category in that construct for somebody who is neither or both, however you want to conceptualize that. So that's the first thing. The second is not only do we construct it as a binary, but the nature of the binary is oppositional, right? So difference is one thing, right? So computer mouse and a cup of coffee, right? Those are different, but computer mouse is not the opposite of coffee in the same way that male is understood to be the opposite of female. So it's a special kind of construct. It's a construct in which not only are the two things different and exclusive, but one is the opposite of the other. And you can kind of see the way that this has played out as our understandings of the construct and its limitations and some of its drawbacks have kind of been made apparent to us. One of the things that's happened is that people have tried to shift from a binary model to a continuum model. And a continuum model says that on one end of a continuum, there are males, and on the other end of the continuum, there are females. And there are a wide range of variations in between because, sex categorization is based on reproductive organs, and some people are kind of unambiguously male in that they have penises and testes. Other people are unambiguously female in that they have vaginas and ovaries. But some people have some combination of reproductive organs, right? Some people might be sort of square in the middle of that sort of binary sort of understanding of sex. Some people might be somewhere in between, but maybe closer to female than male. Or other people may be somewhere in between, but closer to male than female. So we go from having two sexes to having 5 sexes, 3 sexes, 15 sexes, as many sexes as we want, because once you sort of recognize that there are a lot of ranges or a lot of types of variation in between those two kind of configurations of reproductive organs, you get a lot of variability. So the construct is designed, like most constructs are, to simplify something that's relatively complex, even though the complexity is not as pronounced or widespread as some of the elements of racial constructs. They are nevertheless still there. So when we sort of recognize that people who are born intersex, right, people who have genital characteristics of both sexes, that sort of problematizes our oppositional binary of males and females and only males and females. But in response to that, we still build a model that's predicated on this idea that males and females are opposites. So you get a continuum, but you still have male and female on opposite ends of that continuum. And as you get closer to being biologically male, the further you're getting from being biologically female, even if you never get all the way to the end of that continuum. So you can see the way that previously existing understandings or previously existing constructs can shape what we do with new information, with inconvenient facts or shocking discoveries or other things that kind of undermine our sense of confidence in the models that we have to describe the world around us. Those models are still going to shape the new models because we're building on that previously existing foundation. In social psychology, we call this sedimentation. It's kind of how social order gets built up over time. And we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but the point here is that this is a well-established sort of principle. So when we are talking about sex, we are talking about our understandings of the biological nature of human organisms, whether that's as kind of a binary in which there are two and only two categories, or a multiple category configuration. Now, I think it's probably more accurate to say that human sexual categorization is bimodal rather than binary, right? So you can take the attributes or qualities that make up male, and you can kind of plot a curve, and you can take, and there's a distribution of those attributes around a mean. Then you can take the same thing with regard to females, and you can build another curve. And those curves overlap to a certain extent. They're still distinct curves. So bimodal just means two modes or two different clusters or patterns. But the idea here is that, and the important thing is that when we are looking at sex, we are actually looking at a cultural and social construct, not an absolute sort of biologically verifiable phenomenon that we can say that organisms are mostly female or possess mostly female characteristics, or organisms are mostly male or possess mostly male characteristics. But to say that organisms are indisputably and objectively either male or female is again incorrect. It's an oversimplification of what is actually something much more complex. Now, gender, which is different than sex, and that needs to be said because there are people in society who kind of conflate the two terms and they use them kind of interchangeably. But gender refers to cultural and social definitions of masculine and feminine, not male and female, masculine and feminine. In other words, the things that we expect people who are biologically sexed male or biologically sexed female to do because they are biologically sexed male or biologically sexed female. So think of gender as a set of behaviors or attributes or performances. Lots of different ways to kind of think about this, but the things that we show to other people to indicate the category of gender that we're kind of asserting claim to. And you can see right away, and by the way, this is also a social construct, right? There is no objectively rigid, sort of measurable and falsifiable notion of gender. What was normative for a particular gender at one point in a society's history may no longer be normative, right? At some other point in that society's history. Several hundred years ago, women only wore dresses, and now in the 21st century, women wear pants. They also wear dresses, but they more frequently will be found wearing pants. That's very unusual in the 1600s. It's fairly conventional in the 21st century. So when we think about gender, think about the things that you observe about a person that indicate to you, and perhaps to others, and maybe even to those people themselves, which sex category they belong to. And right away you can see how problematic that is, because people who are biologically sexed male could perform or engage in femininity. They could do and say and act in the ways that we expect biological females to act, even though they're not biological females, and vice versa. So that phenomenon is something we call transgender. So somebody who is assigned male at birth, but who engages in a set of gendered behaviors that we identify as feminine, is a transgender woman, right? Because their gender and their underlying sex category don't align. When somebody's gender behavior and their underlying sex category align, we say that those people are cisgendered, right? So this is what we mean. But because people who are biologically sexed female can still do the gendered behaviors of masculinity, and because people who are biologically sexed male could engage in the gender performances of femininity, we can hopefully start to see the way in which your underlying sex category shapes but is not determinative of your gender. The reason why those things align the way they do is that we socialize people to a set of appropriate behaviors based on whether you are biologically sexed female or biologically sexed male. So what we get out of this is a whole set of behaviors that we call gender roles. And gender roles reflect these kind of understandings of gender differences that are specifically emphasizing the characteristics that people learn in that socialization process. So what biologically sexed males learn to do and to attribute to their underlying biological sex category is a set of gender roles, right? We perform or we engage in masculinity, and vice versa. So every society has a set of gender roles, and we'll talk a little bit more about the underlying foundation of those and why they're kind of why they operate or how they operate the way that they do. We'll talk about that in a moment. What I want to point out, though, is that in addition to every society having a set of broadly accepted and normative gender roles, there is also gender stratification, right? So one of the things that happens, because we have underlying assumptions about the nature of males and females that are reflected in the expectations that we impose on people in the form of masculinity and femininity, there are certain jobs and tasks and social behaviors that are assigned to men, and there are other social behaviors and tasks and responsibilities that are assigned to women. And historically speaking, that has created or enabled the creation of what we call a gendered division of labor, right? Things that men do because they're men, and things that women do because they're women. Now, I want to make it clear, because people will often kind of get this a little bit blurry in their heads. When we talk about gendered behaviors, we are not talking about things like giving birth, right? So giving birth is something that biological females can do because they have certain biological features as organisms. They have a womb, they have a place to gestate a fertilized egg and then later a fetus. They have a vagina and a birth canal that allows them to give birth. Their breasts lactate so they can nurse infants and newborns. Those are things that biological males cannot do. Biological males can produce sperm, right? But beyond those biological differences, the gender differences are not so rigidly applied, right? Men and women, not males and females, I want to be really clear, men and women, so we're talking about gender now, can both hold a baby, right? That's a skill set. That's something that anybody can acquire. The fact that women acquire that skill set more frequently than that, or the fact that females acquire that skill set more frequently than males, and the fact that females tend to be better at those skills than males, is a function of the way that we treat people who are biologically sexed female and male differently by emphasizing different things in the socialization process, right? We encourage young females to play with dolls in a way that hones those skills. We discourage young males from playing with dolls, which leads to a lack of development of those skills. So that if you took two late adolescent, early adult males and females, and a male and a female, right? Late adolescence, early adult, male and female, and you kind of compared them on skill sets when it comes to things like holding babies, the general consensus is that the female would be better. But it's not because she's biologically female. It's because when she arrived in society, she arrived in a society that cultivated those skills and abilities in her because she was biologically sexed female. That's being a woman. That's being feminine. So if you have a trans man, right, so somebody who was assigned female at birth, but is engaging in a set of gender behaviors appropriate to biologically sexed males, that trans man can still deliver a fetus, right? They can still become impregnated. A man, in essence, can become pregnant and have a baby. Just like a trans woman can impregnate somebody who has, a uterus and ovaries. And again, there are some people who sort of, they get rigid and they sort of try to push back against that because in their head, male, female, masculine, feminine are the same thing. But they aren't, and no amount of wanting them to be will make them so. Which is why this is a big friction point in our culture, in our society, and why we're having these, sort of interesting and I think sometimes beneficial, other times exasperating debates about trans people and gender and sex and what all of that means. What is generally true, though, as a result of this gendered division of labor, is that the things that men do and the things that women do are valued differently, and they are rewarded differently, and they're given divergent levels of social standing and prestige. In other words, we get a stratified system, a system of inequality that's organized around gender. So the things that women do, by and large, are undervalued relative to the things that males do. That's a concept that we call androcentrism, right? And the way that you can see androcentrism is in things like, for example, the way that certain occupations go through a process of what we call de-skilling. As some occupations became sort of the exclusive or typical occupation of, say, for example, females, the pay the prestige, the autonomy, the power, the responsibility of those occupations diminish because those occupations go through a process of de-skilling. In other words, the abilities and skills that used to be required to do those kinds of jobs are routinized, or they're given to administrators or other oversight bodies, and the job becomes kind of just rote or sort of a routinized set of actions and behaviors. And if it's something that anybody can do, then the justification for high pay and high prestige and high status begin to get eroded. So that's what we call de-skilling, and occupations that become dominated by women tend to get de-skilled. And as a result, you get differential rates of pay for women in the formal economy versus men in the formal economy. But also even within occupations. So let's say you have an occupation in which both men and women, males and females, are participating. Men are often paid more than their female counterparts. This is where we get what we call the gender wage gap, right? The difference in salary and wages between men and women in identical occupations. And the gender wage gap is also something that intersects with with race and with ethnicity. So women get paid less than men, but black women get paid less than white women. So you're getting a sort of a multiplier effect when you compound race and gender inequality together. So this is kind of a reflection, as I said, of the tendency to sort of value the things that we associate with men. Another way you see this is in the way that society deals with gender transgression. Now, I'm not talking about trans men and trans women. This is a little bit different, but it's the same sort of general ballpark. When young, at pre-adolescence, so we're going to make this simple, and we're going to kind of extract the impact of something like puberty. If we look at prepubescent boys and prepubescent girls, and we watch what happens to them when prepubescent girls engage in more typically masculine behaviors that are appropriate to boys of that age as opposed to appropriate to girls of that age. So they play sports, they like to get dirty, they get their knees scuffed, they're kind of tough, they don't mind fighting or wrestling around, right? The cultural term that we have for these girls is tomboys. And generally speaking, I think you can make an argument that as a culture, as a society, we don't really feel negatively about tomboys. We don't really denigrate them. We don't vigorously and aggressively police that gender boundary line. The idea is, or the hope is, I suspect, for some people who are a little uncomfortable with tomboys, is that it's a phase and that they eventually grow out of it. But I think in a lot of ways, we sort of celebrate tomboys. If you look at young adult literature, very often strong female characters who are rational and tough and all of those other kinds of characteristics are valorized a little bit. They're made central characters. They're not marginalized or treated poorly in the film or the television or the literature medium in which we find them. So I would say that on the whole, in the United States in the 21st century, we have a generally favorable disposition toward tomboys. On the other hand, young boys, pre-adolescent boys, who do the things that we typically associate with girls of that age, right? Being concerned with keeping their hair neat, dancing, dressing up, looking nice, cooking, playing with dolls, things of that nature. The terms that we have for those boys are not analogous to tomboy. We would call them sissies or pansies or mama's boys, right? Really, really denigrating, insulting sort of terms. It's the same behavior, right? It's just a young boy doing things that we typically associate with young girls. And when a young girl does things we typically associate with young boys, we go, well, she's a tomboy, and we kind of just shrug and move on, or in some cases, we applaud it. But when a boy does the same thing, we act with, we as a society, we as a culture, I don't mean necessarily any one of you, but we collectively sort of pull back, and that makes us a lot more uncomfortable. So much so that we'll police it with really, really negative terminology and not social acceptance, but rather social rejection. And it's because we value the things that are associated with masculinity. So a little girl who wants to be more like a little boy makes sense because being a little boy is better in the eyes of society than being a little girl. A little girl being a little girl is fine because she's a little girl and that's what she's supposed to do. A little girl wanting to be more like a boy is also okay because boys are awesome. We understand why they would want to aspire to that sort of privileged position. A little boy doing the things that we associate with little boys is normative and appropriate, but a little boy doing the things we associate with little girls makes us uncomfortable because we clearly don't value the things that we associate with femininity as much. Right? That's what we mean by androcentrism, right? It's just the valuing and the centering of men and masculinity and male experiences, and the marginalization or the othering or the diminishment of things that are associated with females and women and femininity. All right, so that's I hope that illustrates gender stratification and kind of its social psychological underpinnings, right? The cultural value of androcentrism or the ideology of androcentrism. Okay, as I said, there are some biological foundations that people often point to say here is why we have gender differences and why we have gender roles as a result of gender differences. And I do want to point out the biology or the biological underpinnings of this are in some regard very, very objectively concrete. They're measurable, they're real. There are chromosomal and hormonal differences among human organisms, and those chromosomal and hormonal differences can create physical differences in human organisms. I'm very explicitly and intentionally trying to avoid saying that there are chromosomal differences between males and females because there are chromosomal differences between all human organisms, male, female, or any other sort of categorization that we want to create. So it's very, very important to keep that in mind, that there are differences among organisms. So sex differentiation begins to occur after 6 weeks of conception. And again, that appears to be a function of the way in which chromosomes operate to generate those sex differences. So we are not born, or conceived, I should say, we're not conceived male or female, but rather over time become more male or more female. And again, all the gradations in between as we reach about 6 weeks after conception. The secondary sex characteristics also have a sort of a foundation in biology, right? So hormonal differences that begin with the release of hormones or the accelerated release of hormones in adolescence, in puberty, lead to the development of secondary sex characteristics, larger breasts, facial hair, other body hair, changes in musculature and skeletal elements, deepening of voice, right? So those kinds of things start to happen as a person reaches adolescence, right? As they reach puberty, a second set of differences begin to get generated by the release of chemicals in their bodies. Again, very, very important not to sort of just think about that in that binary sort of way, that estrogen and testosterone, for example, are present in both biological males and biological females and in intersex people. So there are some, and look, we are as a species, we reproduce sexually. So of course there are differences that allow for the fertilization of an egg and the gestation and delivery of a fetus, right? That is just sort of a fundamental biological reality. But again, there are people whom we might assign to one or the other of our two sex categories that can't do those things because they're biologically not squarely in this kind of non-existent box of just two and only two options. So it gets a little sticky, and since this is not going to be a class where we dive deep into that, I'm just going to kind of leave it there. But just understand that there's a lot more there to kind of unpack, and both biology and the social sciences are spending a lot of time sort of evaluating their models, and sometimes even reevaluating or rejecting models as we learn more and we think more critically about the nature of these things. which, again, the the social construct of sex reinforces the social construct of gender, which makes it then sometimes hard for us to fundamentally critique either sex or gender because they seem so natural and they seem so inextricably connected. I'll get into that a little bit more in just a moment. There are two things that you need to remember about biology and gender roles. And the first I just kind of alluded to, which is that gender norms build on, exacerbate, and reinforce physical differences. Right? Again, physical differences exist, but the gender norms that are fundamental in society kind of make those differences much more significant. Sometimes literally making them significant by bringing them into a kind of symbolic understanding, right? That we have a performative masculinity, a performative femininity that reflects kind of that underlying idea that there are some signifiers of one's biological status, but that are actually just gendered performances. They just look like they're natural. They look like they're things that kind of just flow inevitably from biology. So that's the first thing, right? Gender norms build on, exacerbate, and reinforce physical differences. Number two, femininity and masculinity are not uniformly shaped from genetic makeup. I'll say that again. Femininity and masculinity are not uniformly shaped from our genetic makeup. They vary, right? What it means to be feminine, what it means to be masculine, varies from culture to culture. It varies within a culture over time. Right? Masculinity in the 21st century looks different than masculinity in the 17th century and the 18th century. So remember, human evolution is a long and slow process, right? Because one group of humans lives in East Asia, and another group of humans live in Southwest South America, and another group of humans live in the northern reaches of Europe. Does not mean they have different biologies, right? The biological differences within the human, within human organisms, doesn't evolve and differentiate that quickly, right? So when we look at the differences in masculinity between the 21st century and the 18th century, we can't say that that's accounted for by evolutionary development or change, right? Because that doesn't happen nearly that quickly. So it's clearly indicating that these are shifting constructs, right? That our expectations of biologically sexed males in the 21st century are different than our expectations of biologically sexed males in the United States in the early 1800s or the early 1700s. So they vary from culture to culture. They vary within a culture over time. They vary over the course of a woman's or a man's lifetime. So when we think about the gender norms of young females, they look very different than the gender norms of females in early adulthood. And those look different than the norms of females in middle age, and those look different than the norms of females in their senior years. Same thing with men, with males. So over the course of a lifetime, what it means to be masculine or feminine varies. The genetic makeup doesn't vary, but what does vary is the notion of how those people should behave. And finally, and this is really, really important to note, that the notions of femininity and masculinity vary between and within groups of women and men. So there's variation by class. Being feminine in the working class looks different than being feminine in the middle class, looks different than being feminine in the upper class. Notions of femininity and masculinity vary by race. They vary by ethnicity. They vary by sexuality, right? So again, the variability of gender norms. I mean, gender norms are ubiquitous. Every society has them. They're all over the place. But what those specific expectations are vary. But the underlying biology, the underlying biological differences doesn't vary that much, right? So that the underlying biological foundation cannot account for the variability in the gendered behaviors. So we want to sort of, when we're thinking about this critically, we want to separate sex and gender. We treat them as inextricably connected, but that is just an ideology. The ideology here specifically is something we call biological essentialism. Biological essentialism is an ideology that says that gender differences reflect deep, natural, and innate sex differences. But they don't. We've set up a set of social expectations and socialization processes around people who are born biologically male, and those differ from the ones that we set up and arrange for people who are born biologically female. So biological essentialism sort of it's an ideology that enables the gender differences to become understood as inevitable reflections of the underlying biological differences. Now, the social foundations or the social bases of gender roles are a little bit more, I don't know if robust is the right word. I guess I'm kind of struggling for the correct language here, but they're more clearly grounded in social processes, and they're more clearly grounded in material conditions within a given society, and so they are easier to see in terms of their constructed nature. We tend to privilege biology and sort of treat it as if it's something that it sort of exists outside the scope of social construction, though hopefully you all see that that's not true. But when it comes to gender roles and their sort of social underpinnings, we can observe a couple of things. First, all societies feature some form of a gendered division of labor. I mentioned that earlier, right? This idea that people who are biologically male are assigned certain tasks, and they're treated in a particular way by the socialization process. Remember, socialization starts at birth, and a lot of the really important stuff gets done in those first couple years of life, but it never stops, right? It is a lifelong process. So in that socialization process, we both instruct biologically sexed males in the things that we expect them to do. We also police the degree to which they conform to those expectations, right? So we keep them in line with threats to their social standing or rewards, kind of carrots and sticks. If you go along with these social expectations, your life is going to be a lot easier. If anyone doubts that, look at the current plight of trans people in the United States who are struggling because we as a society are so insistent that biological sex and the gender roles to which we attach, I should say, to those sex categories should not and cannot be separated, even though they clearly can be. So all societies have a gendered division of labor. But as I was mentioning before, notions of masculinity and femininity are going to vary across culture and across societies. So while every society has a gendered division of labor, what that gendered division of labor looks like is not universal to all societies, right? So do you follow? Every society organizes tasks by gender, but the way we do it in this society over here and the way that this other society does it over here might not look the same at all. Right? They both have a gender division of labor, but what their gender division of labor looks like is quite distinct. So those biological essentialist ideas tend to assign what we call expressive roles to females, and they tend to assign what we call instrumental roles to males. But again, not in a uniform, fashion across all cultures, or across all cultures, or across a culture within, within its history, across its history, I should say. Um, so in most societies, domestic and family settings are women's worlds, and in most societies, political and public settings tend to be men's worlds. But within that space, there's quite a lot of variability, which if these things were flowing specifically from the underlying biological distinctiveness of males and females, we would not see nearly so much variability. So I hope that kind of clears up some of this stuff. Again, as always, if you guys have questions, that's what the in-class discussions are for. That's what email is for. That's what sort of literally or metaphorically raising your hand and asking is for. So again, if any of this is unclear to you, reach out to me. And otherwise, I'll say have a good one, and I'll see you next time.